All right. So there's some more work that happened this morning, so I don't think I can, somebody else can probably speak better on exactly where we are. But there's some stuff about Okta that we don't understand. Trying to understand, is our app logging in as a user, but it's some kind of super user who can create other users, or what is going on with the Okta integration and the token flow?
Yep. So that is the, when a user, there's two different, there's a bunch of different flows, first of all, in OAuth that are defined differently depending on different purposes. In fact, there's more than a few. There's a whole bunch, and there's lots of little variations. So you kind of have to just pick one that works. The OpenID Connect one is basically what is used in most applications, because it was kind of a simplification or standardization of the basic flow of you have a single page application. The key to that is that you can't put any secrets in that, because obviously the person has it in their browser and they can dig through it eventually and find all your secrets that you have in there. So that makes SPAs were specifically tricky when it came to this type of authentication, because there was no way to put there was no way to store secrets in there, whereas normally you had a backend application and it was rendering on the back end, you can have all your secrets there and whatever, it's easy.
Gotcha.
And so the way to get around that was there was this flow called implicit, which kind of just said, if somebody shows up and they authenticate, you know, they can sort of give a client ID and say this is what application they're authenticating for on behalf of, and it just kind of worked. It wasn't the most secure, and if you read into it, there's actually a lot of warnings that say this is not very secure, but this is kind of the best that the world has to offer right now. And so since then, it's gotten better. There's a flow called PKCE, which uses basically cryptography to try and close that gap and basically validate that the person coming into authenticating against the identity provider is who they, you know, is who you want them to be. And then CORS adds another couple layers on top of that to try and make it more secure. And so that's the flow that is set up within Prismatopia as kind of the standard flow that is pretty much industry standard for authenticating. And what happens is the user,
Sorry,
when
can I ask brief clarifying questions?
Yep.
So we are using PKCE.
You're using the whole flow is basically it's OpenID Connect with PKCE, yes,
Okay.
enabled, and that's generally the default now, because it's sort of the, again, like it closes the gap that was there before PKCE.
Yeah, whenever I look in documentation, I think it refers to both flows almost all the time, but it's good to know that we're in PKCE and we need to understand PKCE.
Because what you'll see now is whenever they have they will let you use the implicit flow, but they will always warn you that this is not very secure. If you need to use it, you can use it. Some older browsers don't support PKCE, so it's still around, but PKCE has kind of been like the standard because it closes some of those gaps.
Before I turn it over to some other folks to talk specifically about the app, I want to ask some specific Okta questions, if you don't mind me screen sharing real quick. So when I go to Okta as a developer, I think it's just developer.okta. Let's just go to Okta, it'll take me in. So when I go to my Okta developer account, so the first thing is right now we're using our, so I think this is my Lambda school, right? So should I be using a personal Okta account? Should I be using my official Okta account? Or should we somehow create something for our app?
It should be created for your app, yeah, exactly.
But it's inside of my personal account, right?
There's different, each of those are different domains that are managed. The Lambda School one is managed by Lambda School, and that one is specifically for you as a Lambda School student. That's your identity. You won't have any admin in that, obviously. That one is just administered by Lambda School. So that's that domain. The domain is basically a place where you can authenticate applications against, you can configure, you know, for multiple different applications and flows and stuff. What you want is an account that you can use that's shared across everybody on your team. And you can do that by just creating an account and then adding other people to the team, basically. So if
Okay.
you go to your org,
Your org. Okay.
yeah, yep. And then, yeah, this is a developer view. And they started popping this page up recently, which kind of annoys me, but I usually just ignore it. So if you scroll up to the top,
Yep.
the key things are like under applications. These are the clients that will be, or the applications that will be authenticating against this domain, basically. So
Okay.
meaning this is where your front end as the client, the one that's running on people's browsers, will authenticate. And then also your back end, not necessarily your back end, but your makefile. So generating your Apollo token is also another client of this domain.
So I only need one client, or I need two clients?
You're going to need two. You're going to need one that's set up for your SPA, your
Okay.
Create React front end, and then another client that is set up for the makefile.
I see. And then when I looked at the Prismatopia documentation, it referred to create an app for a native client. This is the app I created for the native client, but the whole purpose is this client only exists to authenticate my developer token when I'm developing personally.
Right, from the makefile. Because
From
on
the
the makefile, you are on your machine, you can store a secret, it's protected, it's fine. And there's obviously, when you're on the command line running make Apollo token, there's no way to redirect, there's no browser to redirect or anything.
I see. So this is
Yeah,
like my personal authentication server for my personal
yeah.
development environment. And even though the software is going to use a similar flow when I deploy it, I need to create a new application for my deployed environment.
Yes. So this one is the flow that you can use a key, you can use a secret with,
Yep.
and because you're on your machine. And
Yep.
the other one is one where you can't use a secret
Yep.
because you're distributing it to people's
And I
browsers.
know what you're talking about. When I go to general, I know I had to come down here and click
Yep.
this. So I
Yep.
turned off PKCE and I turned on this bootleg thing.
Yep.
And that's okay for my development environment. But when I deploy my application, community calendar, we're going to have to
Yep.
figure out how to do PKCE.
Yep. And you'll notice that it when you select PKCE, the secret goes away
Yep,
because
I did notice that.
yep, because there's no more secret, because you obviously can't put a secret on a browser because anybody can get it.
Okay,
Yep.
this is good. So we're not quite in the code yet. I'm still working through some of these Okta isms, if that's okay. So
Yep.
when I'm ready to deploy, I need to add an application.
Yep.
Do I
You're
need to
gonna do it.
create clients for
You're gonna be an SPA because you already got the native one. You got the one for the make file. So
yeah.
you're gonna want one for an SPA.
What about my native iOS client?
Yes, although that'll use a similar flow because the same thing. If it's on somebody's phone, you can't put a secret in it because they can get the secret.
Yeah.
And honestly, I'd have to look at the exact differences of how they configure them. This is like a wizard view of how to do this. This sort of like pre-configures some things to
Yeah.
kind of make it easier to work with. But yeah, I think for the iOS one, you go through the native flow and create a separate, and all you end up with is 3 client IDs. One client ID for your makefile to use, because that's your makefile as its client, because that way it knows which flow is going to happen. One for your SPA, and then you might be able to reuse the one for the SPA in your native app because the flow should be the same. It's really going to depend on the client that you're using to authenticate and what flows it supports. You may need to create the iOS one, but honestly, the SPA one, like, there's not much difference between SPA and an iOS client or any type of client because.
I will say, looking at this looks familiar for me because I'm more familiar with Auth0, and we started our app on Auth0, and now this is pretty much PKCE in action.
This is really OAuth in action. So PKCE is just the protocol that communicates back and forth. In fact, it's just a layer on top of that. But all this is really just OAuth. So that's why it all looks familiar, because in theory, this all has to be identical if both companies are going to claim that they do OAuth. They all have to use the same terminology. They all have to kind of use the same flow, basically. And that way it's pretty much cross-compatible.
And what I understand the gist of this is that actually there's a whole circle of requests that goes around to authenticate the user, from the app to the OAuth server to my backend.
And there's a bunch of little checks that happen. So the login redirect URI basically says to Okta is somebody's going to come in and authenticate, and when they come in and authenticate, they're going to give you a place to redirect back to. Where do you want to allow them to redirect back to? Ideally, you set that to just the places you want them, like your application. Otherwise, somebody else's application can send them to authenticate, and then they come back to their application with a JWT, and they now just stole your JWT. So all of these are like little checks to make sure to cover all of the little contingencies of people trying to like circumvent, these flows and and steal stuff basically.
Okay, so this makes some more sense. And then this is more developer implementation thing. At least with Auth0, we hit the wall on the native and the website where we more or less, and I know this is what they want you to do, is to go to their website, log in on their website, get redirected back to your app.
Yep.
What do you think of native login flows? Is it just a matter of like abstracting this, reading the docs, finding the actual hooks, like the post requests and where those post requests are going?
Usually they'll have all of the major ones, including Okta, let me see, iOS, SDK. They'll have like some kind of SDK or quick start that will have components like React. They have a React widget that handles all this, and it actually works with middleware. And so you go through and you just kind of configure it on your native app and it works. And they do have an iOS kind of quick start that goes through and shows you how to basically set it up for iOS using their SDK basically. So I'm just looking through it now, and it generally tends to be just a little bit of code, a little bit of cut and paste, and then importing a library. But usually they'll have like a way that you don't have to write a lot of the code and stuff. Okay. You just have to integrate. They've already kind of figured out like the best practice way to do it.
Okay, no, that helps a lot, Bernie. Thank you. So I feel like I understand more what's going on. And the thing is, when I create this application, right, I'm just going to create it now, even though I haven't filled out any of this information. I've just created a single page application. Let's say this is the real deal, right? How do I share this with my team?
Yes, if you go to users, so you want your team to be able to get into this and
do everything I can do.
Yeah, so if you go in and you could just do add person.
Yeah.
And then you can put their email in there, first name, last name, and that will send them an invite, so they'll be able to log in. The next thing you need to do is make them an admin
of this specific app.
Yeah, of your whole domain, actually.
Okay.
Yeah, because don't forget, within a domain, you can have lots of apps. You just happen to be just setting up one, but you can have 20, 30, whatever application clients that authenticate this domain. The domain is really just a set of identities, right? So it's the set of users that may be specific to your single app, or you may be running a company and you have users in your whole company like we do. Like our Okta actually supports lots of different applications to allow us. It's a way to sort of like take identities out of your application, put them into another service, and then allow authentication for however many apps you want to have. Okay. In this case, though, it's going to be specific to your app. So
yep. So right now, this is me, and I'm admin of all my apps. So when Rachel and everybody creates an account, we make her admin of this. This will be community calendar. We make her and everybody else in the team an admin of this. Question.
Yep.
When people come to our website and create accounts, are they also just going to ultimately be in this little user database?
Yep. This is where they'll live. This is where all your identities for all of your users, admins, everything will live. This is your directory, so that you don't have to have this in your application.
For sure.
So that you don't have to worry about protecting it and the secrets and all of their personal data and everything else. Right. This is all.
Yeah. Right. And so I could just fill up my database with users by hitting this add person button and sending out emails. But of course, these people want to go visit an application. So not just be in my little Okta database.
Yep.
So I feel like that answers most of my questions specifically about Okta, the web portal. And now I know a little bit better how to navigate this and how the pieces work together.
Yep.
I'm going to open it up for anybody else to ask questions about Okta, and then I'm going to hand it over to Rachel and Mark to talk about how we're handling the PKCE flow within actual community calendar. So any questions about Okta and Okta portal, guys? Okay, cool. Yeah, I feel like that really demystified it for me, Bernie. I feel like I understand a lot more what's going on and how we're supposed to do this. Yep, and my big takeaway is that this application is an implicit auth flow that is only secure for me to use on my own computer in my development environment. And I'm going to have to create new clients, at least one for my single page application, maybe a second for my iOS clients. That also authenticates my users. Okay, and now let's figure out how do we do this.
How do you do the authentication?
Yep. So Rachel and Mark.
All right, I guess I'll talk. So migrating from Auth0 to Okta, how we had Auth0. So like I noticed Prismatopia, it requires you to always be authenticated. So my question is, do we create, so like we have endpoints that don't require a user to be logged in our app. Do we create like a default token that our app always has? That way it's authenticated with Okta, and then when a user logs in, it'll change that.
So the way, once you're in the back end, right? So what you're going to end up having is secure routes and not secure routes, right? But since you're using GraphQL, it's a little bit different. What are the things that users are going to do? Like what queries will they be able to hit from your backend that won't be like authenticated, that you won't need them to be authenticated?
Like searching for events, you don't need to be logged in. You need to be logged in to create events. So like the way we had it with Auth0, so like when a user creates an account with Okta, I was thinking, so in Auth0 we had something called a rule, which is like a node sandbox environment that would check if the users, it would basically like write to the database, store that Auth0 ID in the database, and then it would give back the user ID from our database and store that in the JSON web token. That way, when the backend gets that, it can just pull that out of the web token instead of like, so there's no, so I was looking at like event hooks, inline hooks for Okta. Is that like how, like when a user registers an account, it would hit REST endpoint on our backend to add them to talk to Prisma, and then add it to our database. That way the Okta ID can be linked to like all the event like stuff in our database.
So what happens is on the front end, we'll go through like the secure stuff, and then we'll talk about like how to do like stuff where you don't need to be authenticated. So what happens on the front end, right, is you send the user to Okta, they authenticate, Okta generates a JWT, and then redirects them back to your callback endpoint, which is actually where the Okta component is listening. And then it will take the JWT, it'll validate it, make sure it's valid, then it will stick that JWT into storage so that you can get it later. So what you want to do is when you're going to make a call down to the Prismatopia API, the Apollo API, that Apollo API is going to expect every call, right now, it's going to expect every call to have the authorization header, and then authorization header is going to have that JWT that you got back from Okta. And then
so like we have everything linked up to the Apollo server, like with Okta and the tokens verifying and everything. My question is like, when a user creates an account, how does that get linked to our Postgres database?
I'm getting there. So when you
Bernie, I'm sorry, maybe this will help, maybe it won't. If you have the Prisma boilerplate, and if you can like kind of point to where it's happening, when it happens, that would go a long way for us.
I was just opening that up actually.
Okay, cool.
I was just showing another team this earlier.
I could also like share my screen and just show you like how our backend set up, and you could kind of just give advice on like.
Let's let Bernie go first, Mark, and then we
let me show you exactly. Let me show you exactly where this happens, because it's I think this will answer your question. So I am in, oops, geez, the context right now. And what happens is when you come in and let's see, where am I? This guy. So when Apollo gets a request in and it's going to start, it's going to hand it off to the resolvers. It needs to create the context for the resolvers, right? Because the resolvers all get a copy of the context. The context is created right here under source context index. And this is it's actually a function that returns a context. And so what this does is this looks at the authorization header, right, which is a JWT that came from Okta. And then inside that JWT, it is going to have a signature. And so what it does is first it validates the signature to make sure that, yes, this came from Okta. No, this was not tampered with. And this also came from your Okta account, right, and nobody else's. Once it validates it, it assumes then that the user that's identified by this JWT is authenticated. And then what it does is it will take that user, take the information out of that user's, out of the JWT, the subject, which is the user themselves, right? That's their Okta ID, that's their identity, that's the only identity you should ever know them by, right? Is their ID, their subject that comes out of that JWT, because that's what they authenticated with. You'll get their email, their name, and then whatever groups they're in that come from Okta. And so this user object is actually put into the context. And so if you say, if you're in your resolver and you say context.user.email, you'll get the currently authenticated user's email. And so that's how you, when you're working in your resolver, when you're writing your resolvers, that's how you know who the authenticated user, first of all, there is an authenticated user. What their ID is, their sort of global ID is, because that's what comes from Okta, and then also like some other details about them, like name, user, or name, groups, etc. So you don't need a users table in your database. You also don't need to ever store that token, because you will always get that token inside your resolvers every time, and it will be there live with the latest information about that user. The only time you would need to have a users table is if you have other details about the user, like preferences, things like that. In that case, you will have a users table, but each row will be keyed off of this value coming from the JWT. And so what you'll do is when you get an API call that comes in, if you want to say get the user's preferences, you're going to query your users table using this ID. If nothing comes back, you know that this is the first time the user's logged in. So you create a record for them with their default profiles. And then from then on, when they come back, they'll always have this same ID, because that's like their identity. And then that's how you query them, basically. That's how you know who they are. And then likewise, if you have users in other tables where they're associated with events or associated with whatever, this is like their ID. The one that you get from Okta is like their universal identity identifier.
So you're saying use the Okta ID as the foreign key for all relationships between that user.
That's their identity, right?
Okay.
Okta manages your identities, and that's where you manage that stuff. So yeah.
Is that how the boilerplate schema is set up right now? Or is the boilerplate schema generating a new ID for the user?
Okta generates the IDs, right? It's the identity provider that generates it.
I guess I just meant in the data model.prisma that we have in the boilerplate.
In the out of the box one? Yeah, that one is, that's a good point. I never thought of that. Yeah. Yeah, that's probably a bad example.
Okay. Yeah, this clarifies a lot.
Yeah. Yeah, that's probably a really bad example to start with, because I'm showing you something that it doesn't make any sense in the context of this. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, good point. I'll change that example. These were always just meant as examples.
The ID is actually a string, but it still has the property @ID.
Yeah,
right?
Exactly. Yeah, this would really what you want is this is like
a string not nullable with property ID. We have a little comment that says this is actually the Okta ID or the authentication provider ID. Okay. That goes a long way, Bernie.
Actually,
Okay, cool.
IDP. Yes,
And
exactly.
then, so something I've noticed is in your context flow is you're throwing the authentication error pretty much as soon as you get the request if they're not authorized.
Yeah, yeah. And so you guys, this is not going to work for you because you need to be able to have certain queries that are not authenticated, right? You need to be able to support that.
Yep.
What I thought is just like wrap the whole thing in a try block and then catch the authentication error and then just pass in user as undefined. If user is undefined, then like you don't need a user for the non-protected endpoints. And then
yeah, actually, even easier is if this authorization header. So let me do a little bit of like research on this because there's a best practice for this. The easy way to do it would be if the header's not there, just don't put the user object in there, and then in your resolvers, if your resolver is one where you need it to be secure, you'll always make sure to check for the user object. If the user object's not there, then you know the user's not authenticated, and you can then throw the error from there. But I think there's actually a mechanism that's even easier to do, so that you can basically say these these queries are secure, these are insecure. I think you can actually do it like with like a decorator, and you just sort of annotate it. I remember reading about that somewhere, so let me try and find that. And then that way you can basically say these require authentication, these don't require authentication, and then yeah.
So okay, so from what I understand is in this context, when we check if the user is in our database. If they aren't, then we will write it to the database.
Yep.
Isn't that like inefficient if you're constantly like checking that like over and over again, calling Prisma like over and over and over and over?
It depends. So you would need to do that, and it depends on your query. Like you wouldn't,
Because like
I don't think you would put it in here. What you would want to do is you would do it sort of lazily, like where you needed it. So where you need a user in the database, you just wouldn't assume they were always there, right?
yeah, so then you would have to put that in every single mutation, which is like repeating yourself over and over again.
It all depends though. Like I don't know the structure of your database or your queries or anything. So, and there's also commands that are built into Prisma called upsert. So if you need to update, you can, instead of doing update, you do an upsert, and that will do an insert or an update depending if they're there or not. So there's a bunch of different ways around it to to make that work. There's no like universal way to do it other than like, I mean, I'd have to look at to see.
That's the only reason, because like I was looking into like inline hooks where you can give Okta a REST endpoint, and it's basically like middleware between Auth0 or Okta and you, like when it creates the token or whatever.
Yeah.
So I thought like when a user logs in, like only when it generates a token.
Yep.
So that way your server is not constantly like, is this user in here? Is this user in here? So like,
yeah, I mean, again, like it depends on it's hard to say there's no like perfect answer for it because it really depends on how the application's architected. But that's the other thing you do too, is after the user authenticates in the front end, you could just send a call down that says like ensure user or something, so that the first call to your API from any browser is always to make sure that the user has a default user account. But the thing is those, depending on how you architected, usually the way you want to do things, especially when setting data, is to do it just in time, to do it lazily when you actually need it. And so you don't usually need to set things in advance like that. In other words, like I said, like when you go to pull their preferences, if they're not there, then you would just create them a new record for preferences. If you needed to pull them, so it depends on how you architected it. Like usually you want to try and like not do writes to the database until you absolutely need to. And that's sort of that lazy write mentality. So if you don't need to put them there in advance, if nothing is going to break, then don't put them there until you really need them in there, and make it kind of stateless until you need them in there, and then you do the write. So it depends on, like, you can do all that stuff in the resolvers, because if the resolver for the user, needs to return the user, then you would do the insert then, right? So instead of returning, so you do your query, oh, the user's not there, but I know they're authenticated, they need a row, so let me create a row for them right there, and then the next time around they get returned.
Yeah, I know we're at the end of the half hour, Bernie, so you gotta run to another meeting, let us know.
Let me just double check. I probably do. Yes, I do.
Okay, gotcha.
Right.
Cool. I'll send you a question over message. I was just gonna ask if this context function is executed every time the server receives a request.
Yeah. Yep.
And that's gonna happen every time, no matter what. Like that's
Yeah,
just how
because
the
that's
server works.
yeah, exactly. Because that's where your authentication happens. It's stateless, so it doesn't remember. There's no session between. So, which is good. That's what you want. That's how you can scale. But yeah, that gets regenerated every time.
Okay, so the context does not persist between requests, and we shouldn't be trying to create some kind of persistence of the context.
No. Because the key is that if you stick that in the database, and when this thing goes, a million users, and you now have 30 databases, you now have to always send people back to that same instance, that same database, and then all of a sudden you make it really hard to scale. Whereas if you keep everything stateless so that everything that comes in can go anywhere and you don't persist any state on the server side, you can scale like crazy. It's so much easier to scale. Things can fall over and fail and it doesn't matter because you just send the next request to the next server and it works.
So pretty much no matter where we authenticate the user, we are executing the context function every time our server.
Yeah, and that's just the way GraphQL works, right?
Okay.
Is that context is new for that request, and that gets sent down the pipe to all the resolvers, and then comes back up. Yep. And then if you need to, if deficiencies with or latencies and stuff like that, you can start to look at caching scenarios and schemes and stuff. But what you want to do is avoid at all costs any type of state in the back end, because that's, as soon as you do that, you've immediately hamstrung yourself as far as scalability. So
okay, cool. Thank you so much, Bernie.
Yep, no worries. We'll see you.
Thanks.